In shonen anime, there are three main types of backstories. First, there's characters who were abused, abandoned, or had an otherwise really tragic past. Then we have the classic Isekai, where the main character lives an average life, then is killed saving some kid or something and is reborn in a new world. There's also ones like this, and of course some that break that pattern completely. And man, some of these characters have had such twisted, complex backstories, you literally need an entire diagram to keep it all in order. And what better way to start off than with everyone's favorite mass murderer, Eren Yeager from Attack on Titan. And on the surface, he has a pretty tragic backstory. He grew up with two best friends. One day, Eren's dad went on a trip and never returned. Classic going out for some milk trope right here, but things get a lot more crazy when these massive man-eating titans suddenly attack their home, which unfortunately leads to the death of Eren's mother. And this of course sets the stage for Eren's determination to join the scouts and finally destroy all the titans. But this is of course just the tip of the iceberg, because if you dive down the rabbit hole, Eren's father Grisha is actually a titan himself who came from outside Paradise Island to have a kid who could eventually take control of this titan power and raise their people up from their persecution. In fact, the first step in all of this was to turn Eren into a titan and literally have his son eat himself so that Eren could gain the powers of the attack and the founding titan as well. But if all of this wasn't yet complicated enough for you, then this happened. And because he touched a person of royal blood, Eren gained all of his father's memories and basically the ability to see all possible futures. Which, if you think about it, means that he planned out and manipulated for everything to happen exactly as it played out in his past. So this whole story is really his entire backstory, which all leads to this moment where Eren tries to destroy the entire world. So, talk about a convoluted start to these backstories, but I do promise not all of them are as complex as this one, though there will be some spoilers for each of these characters as we go, fair warning for this. But while this next backstory isn't quite as complex, it is probably just truly heartbreaking all the same. And that's because Ichigo Kurosaki from Bleach comes from a quite messy lineage. First, his mom was a Quincy, who are a group of humans who can see hollows and other souls, and of course, she passed this ability onto Ichigo. What's difficult though is that his father is a retired Shinigami who have literally hunted down almost the entire Quincy race. So yeah, already awkward family dinners for sure. However, Ichigo was super close to his mother, but tragedy struck when Ichigo's ability to see hollows led him into a trap and he was almost killed by a river-dwelling hollow. However, his mother then sacrificed her own life in order to save him, and even though Ichigo ended up living, this event nearly broke him. After this, he started skipping school, became a delinquent, and got into many fights, which is basically how he remained until we first meet him during his high school years. Unfortunately though, losing mothers is kind of a main theme of many shonen backstories, because even in a food cooking anime like Shokugeki no Soma, Food Wars, the main character's mother still passed away at a really early age. And this basically left Soma, the main character, alone with his dad, who was a world famous cook at the time. Lucky for Soma though, his dad is actually a unbelievably great dad, rare for these anime, and he actually raised his son as a chef, just like he and his wife had always wanted to. However, this of course doesn't mean that life was always easy for Soma. In fact, he challenged his dad to almost 500 cooking duels growing up, and his dad smoked him every single time. This continued until one day Soma's dad told him that he was gonna close their restaurant for 3 years, basically pushing Soma to go to the world famous Totsuki Culinary Academy so he could get more experience cooking with and against other up-and-coming chefs as well. And now while Soma was a wizard in the kitchen, Mob from Mob Psycho is a true genius with his telepathic powers. In fact, his powers were so strong growing up that he seriously injured his brother and two bullies in a fit of uncontrollable rage. And now you might be thinking that he could get past that, but this event traumatized Mob to the point that he basically rejected his powers for most of his life. And this really shaped his overall philosophy that his powers should not be used against other people, except in truly impossible situations, which is exactly what we see near the start of the actual story. Let's be real though, at least Mob didn't get kicked out of his home though, which which is exactly what happened to Lelouch from Code Geass. Now, what makes it even worse was that he was born as the 11th prince of the Holy Britannian Empire, so he was living a pretty good life at this point if you ask me. However, Lelouch threw it all away in one tragic series of events. That's because when his mom passed away, again, Lelouch's father didn't really seem to care all that much. And of course, Lelouch was basically so mad at that he basically called his father a bum, even though he was the king. This of course led to Lelouch's banishment to Japan, where we find him plotting to destroy his former home near the start of the story. And so while Lelouch eventually then played the evil genius role, Senku is a certified rocket scientist who tried to save the world. That's because after he was taken in by his adoptive father, Senku went on a blazing path to fulfill his dream of going to space. He read every book that he could get his hands on, dragged his friends into truly crazy experiments, stole his dad's credit card to buy materials, and even teamed up with a NASA scientist to build a rocket at the grand age of 10 years old. Man, kind of makes you wonder what you were doing with your life at that age. Let's not talk about that. Anyways, somewhere in there, Senku somehow found the time to study an Ebola outbreak in Africa, which means that he was the perfect scientist to help the world recover once the petrification beam nearly wiped out the entire planet. But I think enough with all of the child geniuses now, because it is time to hear the tragic childhood of Gintoki from Gintama now. And when we first meet child Gintoki, he is poor, homeless, and he spends his day walking through battlefields searching dead bodies for food and things to sell. However, his life is then completely changed when he was taken in by his mentor, Toshida Shoyu. And he basically made Gintoki his first student at his swordsmanship school as well. The good times wouldn't last that long though, because years later, Gintoki's mentor was then captured, which led our young swordsman to gather his friends and join the war to save his teacher. This, however, turned out to be a terrible decision, because even though Gintoki found Toshida, he and his friends all ended up being captured as well. And this then put Gintoki in an impossible situation where he was forced to make a truly heartbreaking choice. Either execute his master or kill all of his friends. Which, I mean, is just a really cruel no-win situation if you ask me, but at his teacher's request, Gintoki actually ended up taking his own master's head. This left the friends unable to cope with this, and they all parted ways for good at this point. But that's not all though, because years later Gintoki was then arrested again, but this time it was because he offered to take the place of an innocent woman who was going to be killed as well. However, the executioner then spared Gintoki's life because they knew that he was actually a good dude, but this once again left Gintoki to wander all by himself. Eventually, he then met a woman leaving food at her husband's grave, and of course, the starving Gintoki ate that food, but in return, he promised to protect the woman for the rest of her life, which is where we find him at the start of our story. Which is just a tragic tale of heartbreak and loss before this comedic story even begins, but now we have a backstory with a little less world-changing stakes, and that's because Kuroko from Kuroko Basket is far from your typical shonen hero. It basically all began in the 5th grade when he fell in love with basketball and then quickly learned how to play this game. And by the time he's in middle school, he's part of what is known as the Miracle Generation, because his middle school team won 3 straight championships in a row. However, Kuroko is actually not the star of his team. Far from it, in fact. Instead of swishing threes or hammering away shots on defense, Kuroko is a player who focuses on passing above all else. And to be fair, this does serve him pretty well until he gets to high school, where he falls behind other players due to his sole reliance on passing. And this basically begins his journey of improving himself and his team so he can compete with the best teams in the nation. But as much as Kuroko loves to set up his teammates, Shoyo Hinata from Haikyuu is of course the exact opposite of that. This kid just loves to score, but if you know his childhood, you will understand why, because Hinata is way too short to play volleyball in reality. However, after being inspired by watching a similarly short player dominate a volleyball match, he then decided that he would become a great player no matter what. The only problem was that he literally had no one to play with at his middle school. Seriously, at his school, he was the only member of the volleyball team, so he just practiced by himself in the corner of the gym. And so really, it wasn't until his third year that he finally had some teammates and they were able to join a tournament. Unfortunately though, they got smoked by Kageyama's team here, but with this being the first game that Hinata had ever really played in, he was inspired to do even more, as we see later on in the story. And while admittedly these sports animes don't really have the same life or death stakes that many other shows have, even in an anime like Tokyo Revengers, we see plenty of simple upbringings. For example, the main character Takemichi lived a pretty normal, if sad, life. Because growing up, he got into plenty of fights, he even had some friends, but his life then changed forever in 6th grade when he was saving his friend Hina from getting beaten up. However, there was absolutely no chance that he was gonna win this fight, and he had to be saved by Shichiro, who was the leader of a local gang. That's not all Shichiro did though, because he also passed on his supernatural ability to time travel to Takemichi as well. To be fair though, it only lets you jump back in time exactly 12 years from today, so it's not a completely broken ability, and in fact, Takemichi never used it for the rest of his childhood. Then we learned that he moved out on his own and bounced from job to job all the way until we found him working in the convenience store at the start of the story. And while backstories like this can sometimes hit a little bit too close to home, I can guarantee that you've never experienced anything in your life like Emma's childhood in Promised Neverland. And that's because she and her friends were raised in an orphanage where they were basically forced to study and take tests nearly every day of their lives. There's just one tiny dark twist here though, and that is that this orphanage is in the demon world, and all of these children are basically being raised like livestock to be eaten by the upper class demons, which, if that sounds twisted to you, you are, well, 100% correct. This show is really dark. However, Edward Elric's tragic past is nearly as devastating as that. And that's because he grew up with his brother in a relatively happy life until they were abandoned by their father. At least they still had their mother though, that is until, well, of course, she also passed away from some deadly disease. And this event was so heartbreaking to the brothers that they vowed to study alchemy and learn the forbidden techniques that would allow them to revive their dead mother. However, this path only made things much worse. Because after studying alchemy for years on their own and with a master, the boys finally began their cursed ritual to bring back their mother, but not only did they fail, Edward lost his arm and leg, and his brother Alphonse ended up just a soul tied to a suit of armor. Yeah, fair warning from this anime, don't go messing around with the dark alchemy magic. But enough with the doom and gloom here though, because next up we have Mosh Burndad from Mashal, one of my all-time favorites right now. And even though he was abandoned by his parents because he had no magic, he still lived a pretty awesome life. He had a really kind wizard who adopted him and took care of him, a really strict training regimen that would put any bodybuilders to shame, and of course, lots and lots of cream puffs. Seriously though, how bad can a life really be with that many cream puffs in it? Well, of course, things did get worse when it was discovered that he had no magic at all, and the police were actually sent to kill him, but it all kind of worked out in the end when he joined the Magic Academy. Speaking of police though, this next character was a crime-busting genius who actually solved crimes for the cops from a very young age. However, Shinichi Kuro's life was then flipped totally upside down when he was at a local amusement park and got stabbed with an experimental poison that literally shrunk his body down to the size of a 6-year-old. And to make things worse, he then had to keep his identity secret from the underground organization who had poisoned him, which led to him becoming the famous child prodigy, Detective Conan. However, I do wonder if Conan could have actually managed to bust this next character, because Yagami Light went from being a more or less normal genius high schooler to a true psychopath mass murderer. And it all happened when one day Light found the Death Notebook, which basically allowed him to write down anyone's name and they would instantly die. And while Light initially wanted to use this for good, such as eliminating criminals, just like this police chief father, it all went downhill really fast as his sense of justice got more and more twisted by the killings. And actually, very similarly to Light, Subaru Natsuki from Re:Zero grew up idolizing his dad as well. Unfortunately, this all ruined Subaru's life, because while he wanted to be strong, funny, and popular like his dad, Subaru could only get people's attention by acting out and doing truly crazy stunts, which eventually led him down a destructive spiral of skipping school until he was disowned by his own parents. Yikes. Talk about harsh and also talk about being a bad dad, but at this point, luckily, he then got isekai'd into another world to live a new life and to die many, many, many times. Which honestly is a shockingly similar story to Rudy's Grey Rat's backstory in Mushoku Tensei. Because similar to Subaru, Rudy was lonely and dropped out of school, though he was bullied really badly. However, Rudy took it to a whole new level and was basically a shut-in living off of his parents for 20 whole years. So not quite your typical isekai teenager hero here, but all of that changed when his siblings kicked him out of the house. However, Rudy did have still some good left inside of him, because when he saw a group of kids about to be hit by a car, he jumped in front to save them instead. And like most isekais, when you actually save someone from being hit by a car, that is usually a one-way ticket to a new super cool fantasy world, which is exactly what happened to Rudy as well. And now, shockingly enough, Yusuke Urameshi from Yu Yu Hakusho went through the exact same thing. He was a delinquent kid who even drank, smoked, and gambled, but one day he saved a random kid from, you guessed it, a car accident, and he was then transported to the spirit world and offered another chance at life. So yeah, I guess Yu Yu Hakusho is technically an isekai, and man, these isekai tropes are pretty much in every one of these stories, aren't they? Which is of course exactly why Sung Jin-woo's backstory is so relatable for many of us. That's because the solo leveling main character was originally just a regular dude in a world filled with supernatural abilities. For example, his father was a legendary hunter, but one day he suddenly disappeared. Wonder if we'll be seeing him again. And things got a lot worse though when Jinwoo's mother was then struck with a rare disease that put her in a magical coma. That basically left Jinwoo as the sole provider to both pay for his mom's medical bills and his sister's tuition as well. And so what does he do? Well, become a hunter, of course. The only problem is that he basically has no magic at all, and he's known as the weakest hunter in the entire world. But of course that doesn't stop him, as we see later on in the story. And so very much unlike Jinwoo, Ayano Koji from Classroom of the Elite is essentially the perfect human being right from the moment that we meet him. He is smarter than everyone else, almost stronger than everyone else, and a master manipulator. Except for the fact that he has basically no real emotion and essentially treats everyone like they're a tool in his grand plans to make use of. And this all started when his father raised him in a training program known as the White Room, which basically forced many kids to study and train their entire childhoods to produce the perfect human. And honestly, they kind of succeeded with Ayano Koji, but since he doesn't even have emotions, can we even call him a human at this point anymore? Well, one character that we can say for certain is no longer human is Koro Sensei from the Assassination Classroom. Another classroom, let's go. And boy, buckle up for this one, because this backstory is just a whole nother tearjerker. That's because Koro was born into one of the most vile slums in the entire world in an unknown country. In fact, he never even knew his own name or birthday, but he eventually grew up to become a truly deadly assassin. And he was a really good one at that. The best, in fact, and he eventually earned the title of Reaper after his 1,000th kill. It got even worse for the Reaper though once he actually took on an apprentice, because after years of training his student, they betrayed him, which led to Reaper's imprisonment at a research facility. And this is where things get truly horrifying though, because Reaper was actually experimented on to the point that antimatter cells grew all throughout his body, transforming him into a creature that was more monster than human. And a while later, he would then learn that if he lived too long, then his death could basically lead to a massive explosion that could literally kill the Earth. This then led to the researchers to decide to kill him instantly, so Reaper decided to escape instead. However, during the escape, Reaper's only friend in the entire lab was killed as well, and this shocked him so much that he vowed to fulfill his friend's dying wish, which was for him to be the homeroom teacher for the class 3E. Finally, Reaper used the threat of his self-destructive body to force the world leaders to let him be the teacher, which is where we find him at the start of the story, and he takes the name Koro Sensei. But from a literal monster with no hair, now let's talk about the backstory of Saitama, who is the world's strongest hero in One Punch Man. And this one is pretty simple. As a kid, he dreamed of being a hero, but when Saitama grew up, he was pretty hopeless, just barely scraping by working dead-end jobs. And then, one day, he saved a kid from a monster and was inspired to become a hero. Since that day, he then did his famous workout routine of 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run, and he did this every day for 3 years until he became the world's strongest hero. At the slight cost of his hair though, and there is a bit more to the story, but it's fine. We love the shiny dome anyways, and yeah, you'll get to watch it for yourself. It was worth it though to be able to fight monsters, which is nearly the same dream as Naruto from the famous ninja anime with the exact same name. And when we first meet Naruto, all we know is that he's the village outcast who someday dreams of becoming a great ninja so that the entire village will hopefully treat him with a little bit more respect and dignity. What we didn't know though was the shocking secret that Naruto's father was actually the 4th Hokage, and his mother was the previous vessel for the nine-tailed fox named Kurama. Unfortunately, during Naruto's birth, his mother was kidnapped and the Nine-Tails was released. And that meant that the only way to save the village was to reseal the beast, and while Naruto's parents successfully accomplished this and sealed Kurama inside of him, it tragically cost them both their lives, leaving Naruto to grow up as an outcast and orphan in the village, who for some reason got treated really bad by everyone who should have been really thankful. What is crazy though is that next to Naruto, there is still almost no one who is a bigger outcast than Shinra from Fire Force. That's because as a child, he grew up with his mother and younger brother Sho. And then, one evening, Shinra woke up to find his entire house literally on fire and a demonic being standing in the middle of it all. And while Shinra didn't know it at the time yet, this was actually his mother who had been transformed into an infernal after witnessing his little brother's Adala burst. Regardless, this event awakened Shinra's true 3rd generation pyro abilities, which led many to believe that he was the one who had caused the fire to begin with. And what's even worse though is that because of his trauma, Shinra's face would get stuck in this evil looking grin whenever he was nervous, so everyone thought he was just some sick, twisted kid. And this unfortunately meant that not even his own grandmother would take him in, so the orphan Shinra ended up at Hajima Industries, where they treated the kids like experiments instead of actual, you know, human beings. And this basically lasted until he was 13 years old and he moved out to join the Special Fire Force Training Academy instead. But now though, we do have one of the most truly unique and crazy backstories in all of anime, because Bam from Tower of God was literally dead for thousands of years. That's right, dead. You see, it all started when his parents were climbing the tower with the man who would become king, Jahat. And during the time, Bam's parents fell in love and had, well, Bam. However, Jahat was so jealous that he slaughtered the baby Bam right in front of his own parents. And while we don't know exactly what happened to his dad, we do know that Bam's mother used a spell to keep the child's body preserved, and then she took him outside the tower. And then she left him for literally thousands of years. Still not quite sure how all of that works time-wise, but thousands of years later, Bam was somehow awakened and found by Rachel. Now, of course, Rachel would befriend him and play with him down in the hole, but unfortunately, Bam could never leave the hole until the day that he chased Rachel into the tower at the start of the story. And interestingly enough, we do have another character who technically was dead at the start of their story, because Denji from Chainsaw Man grew up with a truly terrible, messed up life. How it works is that he was a slave of the Yakuza as he worked to pay off his father's debt, and during this time he basically found his little chainsaw devil friend Pochita, who helped Denji fight devils to make money. However, one day the Yakuza straight up killed Denji and chopped him into pieces. Like, seriously brutal and bloody scene right there. However, Denji did survive thanks to Pochita crawling into his chest and becoming his new heart. And so together, the two became the new incarnation of the fearsome Chainsaw Devil, which just sounds insane, I know, but at least it has got some true originality to it. And next up, we have pretty much the happiest backstory here with Tanjiro from Demon Slayer, because honestly, Tanjiro had a pretty great childhood. He had a loving family, and although his father passed away at a quite early age, he still had his mother and all of his siblings as they worked to sell charcoal to stay alive. Of course, all of that then changed when the Demon King ate his entire family, but still a pretty good life up until that, well, one kind of unfortunate event, I guess. However, Natsu from Fairy Tail has a backstory that is simply one of the most mind-blowing in all of anime. Because, you know, on the surface, Natsu was abandoned and then raised by the fire dragon Igneel, who taught him powerful dragon slayer magic. And honestly, that kind of felt like it was all we ever really needed to know, but for some reason, then the story went, you know what, that's not crazy enough. And so we basically later found out that Natsu was born 400 years ago and his family was killed in a dragon attack. But that didn't stop Natsu's brother Serev, the big bad guy, from preserving his body until he could eventually revive him using dark magic. The unfortunate side effect was that Natsu became the host for a demon called End, who's actually supposed to kill Serev, but that was all undone when Lucy. And actually, we're going beyond the backstory here, so let's move on to the simpler past of Goku from Dragon Ball. And Goku's backstory is surprising here because instead of being abandoned by his parents, he was instead given a secret mission to complete as a 3-year-old kid for some reason. I mean, talk about some responsibility early on. Basically, Goku, who technically is an alien, was sent to Earth so that he could grow up and wipe out all life on the planet so that the Saiyans could sell the planet to the black markets. However, that plan all fell through when Goku was taken in by grandfather Gohan. And basically, immediately after being found, Goku's aggressive Saiyan instincts led him to fight the old martial artist, but he was barely defeated by the old man. And so basically next, Goku grew up with Gohan as a wild yet super powerful kid, and it looked like he would indeed grow up to destroy all life on Earth until the day that he fell into a massive ravine and smashed that unbreakable noggin off his head. This traumatic fall caused him to lose all of his memories and destructive Saiyan personality. Thank God for that. After that though, he then grows up as a kid until Grandpa Gohan dies, at which time Goku is then left to fend for himself until meeting Bulma at the start of the anime. Now, while Goku's parents gave him a quite intense mission, Melodia's dad from the 7 Deadly Sins literally cursed him for all eternity. How nice. And that's because Melodius was born as the strongest son of the Demon King. And he was basically all set to take his dad's place one day until he fell in love with the goddess Elizabeth. Boy oh boy, talk about forbidden love. And this choice would go on to have massive consequences for the entire world because eventually Melodius would betray the Demon Clan. However, it did turn out that both the Demon King and the Supreme Deity, neither of them really didn't like either of their children falling in love, so they hit each of them. Elizabeth was basically fated to be eternally reincarnated. Not such a bad curse at first glance, but it gets kind of tragic when we learn that Melodius is essentially immortal, but he was cursed to always have the reincarnated Elizabeth die right before his own eyes. And man, having your eternal love die right in front of you for thousands of years over and over again would break anyone's mind, I think. Which, you know, makes sense why Jonathan Joestar, who is the very OG original JoJo protagonist, also nearly lost his mind when his first love was stolen by his adopted brother. Let me explain. You see, Jonathan grew up in a quite wealthy family, but it all went downhill when his dad adopted an orphan kid named Dio Brando. And this decision ruined Jonathan's life because Dio would do anything in his power to prove himself better than our main character here. Dio would literally bully Jonathan, outperform him in school, ruthlessly harass him, and the final straw was that Dio forced himself upon Jonathan's first love, which left her totally emotionally scarred. However, Jonathan eventually got out from under his evil adopted brother when he moved out and attended the Hugh Hudson Academy, where he wanted to study to be an archaeologist. And then it just keeps going for 7 generations or something. It's JoJo's. Well, next we have another main character whose life was also heavily influenced by an adopted sibling. I'm talking about Asta from Black Clover, who was abandoned by his mother from the moment that he was born. Turns out it was for for a quite good reason though, because his mom's magic basically drains all mana from those around her, so she was doing it to protect the baby Asta. That basically left Asta to grow up in the church and along with his friend Juno, and they learned about the discrimination between the people of the noble realm and those in the Forsaken realm. And this discrimination is what eventually led him to the dream of becoming Wizard King. But first he needed to find his own magical grimoire, which granted him anti-magic abilities, and this is where things get a little bit crazy though, because it turns out that this grimoire actually contains the soul of a devil who was previously adopted by Asta's mother before she passed away. I'm sure that would make her happy though, seeing that her two kids work together in the end. On the other hand, 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬 from Sword Art Online has a much simpler backstory. Really simply put, his parents died when he was 1 and he was taken in by his aunt and uncle. And then he grew up living a pretty regular life from there until one day he learned that he was actually adopted, which then somehow led him to draw away from his cousin and fully embrace the shut-in gamer lifestyle. Simple isn't always bad though, and one character without much tragedy at all is maybe the most famous protagonist in the entire world, which is of course Ash Ketchum from Pokemon. And his life was pretty peaceful. He grew up in Pallet Town dreaming of becoming a Pokemon trainer. He'd spent his time out in the forest looking for Pokemon and otherwise attended some Pokemon camps until he was old enough to become a trainer of his own. Luffy from One Piece, on the other hand, had quite the interesting childhood instead. He basically grew up as an orphan, however had plenty of friendly people to take care of him around him, including one of the world's strongest pirates, Red Hair Shanks. And it was Shanks and his crew who initially inspired Luffy to become a good pirate. However, Luffy's life then changed forever when he ate this devil fruit, which turned his body into rubber. But that's not even the most exciting part though, because Luffy was then later kidnapped, rescued by Shanks, and then made friends with these two other boys on the island who all became lifelong friends. And while those friends would eventually slowly move on, Luffy continued training until he was 17 and ready to start his own pirate adventure. And also, did I mention that he was the son of the world's most wanted man? No? Okay, well, this leads us to another character who spent most of her time alone, the elf mage Frieren, or as it should be pronounced as a German myself, Frieren. Well, the tragedy starts when at an early age her village was attacked by demons who wiped out everyone besides Frieren. And it was in the burning wreckage of her village that Frieren was found by the human mage Flamme, who then trained the young elf in both magic and how to interact with humans. And that last part could probably still use some more work though, because she spent most of the next 800 years or so wandering by herself and studying magic until she met the hero's party, who would then go on to defeat the Demon King. Her one regret in life though is that she didn't cherish that time with the hero party enough, because in the blink of an eye from her perspective, they were all old and dying, while she was still off doing her own thing. But now, for a very special trio of protagonists, we have the Forger family from Spy Family. And let's start with the deadly assassin Yor, who lost both her parents at a very young age. This in the end left her to take care of her younger brother on her own, so she learned the assassin's trade and started killing in order to finance her and her brother's life. Eventually, she became known as the Thorn Princess and took up an undercover role in the Berlin City Hall as a cover for her assassination gigs. And that of course eventually led her to meet Lloyd, whose past is even more mysterious than yours. That's because once he became an undercover spy working for Vestalia, he essentially erased his entire past. The little that we do know though is that he was an orphan of war and later on a soldier for his own home country. However, when he then lost all of his friends, he grew frustrated with the entire war and decided to become a spy to help end the war instead. And ultimately, his dream is to make a world a place where kids don't need to cry anymore, which he's definitely doing with the true MC of Spy Family, Anya. Now, her origins are the most unclear, but we do know that she was created as part of some sort of experiment. That's right, not even experimented on, but literally created in some sort of twisted scientific plot. This of course left her with telepathic powers, which she then used to eventually escape her evil creators. However, she then bounced around foster families for a while until she ultimately met Lloyd at the sketchy orphanage at the start of the story. And yet another kid who turned out to be a hero though is Yugi Muto from Yu-Gi-Oh! And while Yugi's parents never died, he did mostly grow up lonely and was by himself for most of his life. However, that luckily gave him plenty of time to play games, and when his grandfather gave him this ancient puzzle, Yugi spent an unthinkable 8 whole years trying to solve the thing. And boy, maybe it was a good thing it took him that long, because the puzzle contained the spirit of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, which then fused with Yugi's soul and helped him whenever he played Duel Monsters for some reason. Now, Yugi didn't have many friends, but at least he wasn't different from literally 80% of the entire world, because that's exactly how Midoriya from My Hero Academia grew up after learning that he didn't naturally possess a quirk that would grant him some sort of superpower. And even though he was bullied for this, that didn't stop him from dreaming of becoming a hero. In fact, one day he jumped in to save one of his bullies from a villain, and even though he couldn't do much, he earned the respect of the world's greatest hero, All Might. And wow, as you can expect, this changed Midoriya's life like nothing else ever did before. Because as it turns out, All Might just was looking for a new vessel for his own quirk, so he trained Midoriya for months until his body was physically ready to inherit the One for All quirk. And after doing so, Midoriya enrolled in UA and took the hero name Deku. But now moving on to one of the most powerful heroes in all of anime, we do have Gon Freaks from Hunter x Hunter. And unlike most shonen anime, the father-son dynamic actually plays a quite significant role in the story. That's because Gon is the son of one of the most powerful hunters in the world, Ging. However, at the same time, Ging is one of the contenders for the most deadbeat dads in all of anime, because he simply dropped baby Gon off with his aunt and never came back. And basically, Gon grew up completely unaware of his father until the day he almost got killed by a mama fox bear. Luckily, this guy showed up and saved Gon's life, and this event would change Gon's life forever, because Kite was a student of Ging's, and after Kite told Gon a little bit about his father, Gon was determined to become a hunter himself and one day find his father, which is why at 12 years old, Gon thinks it's a great idea to set out to take the hunter's exam. Unlike Gon though, Maka Albarn from Soul Eater doesn't just want to find her dad, she wants to truly surpass him. And there are actually a few things that you need to know about this world, and that is certain people can literally become scythes that can kill and gather souls. Now, Maka's journey all started once her dad cheated on her mom. This led to their parents getting a divorce, and after that, Maka's dad left for good. But the interesting thing is that he's actually the strongest scythe in the world and the weapon of the Grim Reaper. Maka still wants to beat him though, so she sets out to become the greatest scythe master in the world and to create a scythe that can replace her dad as the Death Scythe. And if you thought that that was a complicated family relationship, then just wait until you hear what's next. Because Yo Asakura from Shaman King had a twin brother who disappeared from the family at an early age. This left Yo mostly alone and without many friends, but luckily he was taught the secrets of shamanism and the Great Spirit by his grandmother. Now, this is important because the Great Spirit is the strongest spirit in the world, and unlike most shonen heroes, Yo was pretty lazy, so he wanted to obtain the Great Spirit so he would never have to work hard again. To do that though, he would need to win the shaman fight and eventually overcome his older brother, who was actually the reincarnation of an ancient spirit and became the main villain of the story. However, this next backstory has enough layers that will make your head truly spin, because on the surface, Yuji Itadori from Jujutsu Kaisen has very little backstory at all in a weird way. All we know so far is that he was mostly raised by his grandparents and then was left alone when his grandfather died early in the story. However, when you go a lot deeper into the story, you then learn that Itadori is surprisingly related to one of the main antagonists of the Shibuya arc, the Bloodmaster Chozo. Now, what's important here is that Chozo was born from one of the Cursed Womb death paintings, which is a set of cursed objects created by one of the evilest sorcerers in all of history, Kenjaku. But then what makes this even crazier is that it is later revealed that Itadori's mother was later taken over by Kenjaku, meaning that Yuji's entire birth might have been planned by this evil sorcerer who was actually his mother. And now, while we still have a ton more questions about Yuji's birth and upbringing, you might be surprised to know at how much we actually know about Kenjaku's past and everything that happened before Jujutsu Kaisen. And if you want to know everything there is to know about him and all the other insane lores and theories of Jujutsu Kaisen, you can watch the entire Jujutsu Kaisen iceberg right here. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe. It does really help the channel, even if it's annoying. Otherwise, hopefully, I will see you in this next one.